Hello everyone, Leaf Reed here, and today we have the Da Vinci Code. Yes, this is what I would call baby's first introduction to religious symbology, or, Protestants' first introduction to Catholicism or something. But yeah, no, this is actually a pretty well written book. It's actually a real page turner. I hate using that term because it's so overused, but it's really true. I read this probably over a decade ago, and I kind of came back to reread it. And in rereading it, I was able to appreciate more of the themes in it, how it also just the general pacing of the book. I do feel that in some ways the movies is actually better than the book, simply because the pacing in some places is really, really slow. Like suddenly they're in, a in the Louvre, and they're in the museum, and there's a guy dead on the ground. They're figuring out all the things, and there's development like, oh, they don't know this, and then he doesn't know this, and then he learns this, and then he learns that, and then it kind of goes, and he goes over here to here, and then, in the middle of that, he has to kind of stop, and through the author's mouth, explain everything about a certain piece of art, or this symbol, or this whatever, and what it means. And so it's a much slower book. And so, I mean, it is a double-edged sword. Because of that, you lose a lot more of the lore in the movie. It's more, I guess, actiony, as it should be. But you definitely do, I guess overall, it's definitely a trade-off. There's no way to have really both of them really well balanced. And I found this page that has a earmarked corner that I'm very pedantic about that. Anyway, so it's roughly 500 pages. It's roughly this font. I would say overall it's actually it's a bit on the long side for what it needs to be. I think this could have been done in maybe 100 pages less, maybe 200 pages less. If 500 feels a bit drawn out, where he has to explain everything. And I find what's really interesting or funny about this book is that if you go to a typical chapter and you just go kind of to the end point, or the last sentence in every chapter, that's the one point he's trying to get across, that, oh, we now know this, or we now know this. And it's just kind of a funny pattern I noticed. Something else I appreciate, and I found it in some places but not everywhere, but what I do appreciate about the prose of this book is that it tries to establish tone before speaking. And that's always something I've always been very, I don't know how to say, divided on, where someone will say something, in quotations, and then, they said menacingly or with a growl. And then suddenly you have to almost reinterpret, oh wait, they were saying it like this, and half the time I have to go back and reread what was written. But here, they have something like, her grandfather walked in and then starts speaking. And then it's gently he knelt down and took the key from her, and then he says, this key is very special if you had lost it. So, I don't know, I think that's just a very smart, logical way to format prose, where it's often the times the afterthought is the tone that's established, rather than the pre-establishment before you actually read what is being said. So they could have said, the key's very special if you had lost it, he said gently as he knelt beside her. So instead they put it beforehand. And I've had some experience writing like that, and it feels a bit awkward at first, but honestly, as a reading experience, I'd say it's worth it. It's much better to go through. And so for those of you, for those of you who don't know the story of this book, I mean, I think it's pretty well known, because the movie, the movie's very good. And I would say one of the better adaptations of books in general. I feel like if you've watched the movie, do you need to read the book? Not necessarily. Honestly, if you've seen the movie, you kind of get the gist of it. And this just feels like a slower, more condensed version of it. So if you're a big fan of the Da Vinci Code movie, then I would recommend this. If you're really interested in the lore, the background, who were who was Bouillon, the French Templar who established, the Knights Templar, and the Knights of the Hospital, Knights Hospitalier, and all that stuff. If you're more interested in the lore, it goes a lot more into the lore in this one, obviously. Other things about this book. Oh yeah, sorry, the plot. So the main character is Robert Langdon, a American symbologist, religious symbologist, and he's like a Harvard professor guy who gives a bunch of speeches and talks, and then they allude to some other story where some fiasco is at the Vatican, which is, I think, actually his later book, Angels and Demons or something. This one would be about Dante and the Apocalypse. And so he finds himself in Paris, and he finds himself, being called to the Louvre after his speech at midnight, because one of the people he's supposed to meet with was murdered. And so like, oh, okay. So, it's really interesting how if you were an artist or really an author and you're trying to express a certain theological perspective or philosophy you have, you could just write it out, or you could combine it with murder mystery, make it kind of sexy. And so this is where we have this kind of meeting of intellectual esoterics and then also kind of this crime-ish background. And so it's a mixture of these two universes that kind of make it a pretty distinct type of book, a distinct type of story. And it's something that you don't really see a lot of, but it's often inspired things like obviously things, I cringe, but National Treasure with, what's his face? Nick Cage. And, I was going to say, Assassin's Creed. I would say this, like, I can guarantee, like, whoever, like, this is very on point with Assassin's Creed. It's a French company. This is based in France. The whole esoteric, finding of secrets and everything. Even the cast of characters, it'd be interesting to compare it to the game. But Assassin's Creed, like, I can't imagine it not being influenced by this, like 100%. It's very much the same energy. I think Assassin's Creed, I don't want to say it does a better job. It does something differently. And I think, okay, I'll just get to it. But the best part, I think, of Assassin's Creed 2, where is really, did you see it, like esoteric symbology and whatever, is when in 2, you're doing these series of painting puzzles, for lack of a better word, where you're looking for the pieces of Eden. And so you have these classical paintings, but you're looking for the normal symbols that everyone, knows. Oh yeah, there's a king holding an orb and a staff, but then they're actually magical objects that I've been hiding in plain sight all this time. And so this very much goes to the whole Leonardo da Vinci, where there's Jesus at the Last Supper, and the other character that they argue is Mary Magdalene. If you line them up, the painting is hiding a secret, and it's literally in Assassin's Creed 2. So. I know, I love that stuff. So anyway, and there are some themes in here that are just, just not borderline, but directly, heretical, or not Gnostic. They mention Gnosis somewhere in this book once, but they do kind of entertain that whole idea of alternative church history. That's the whole point of the plot, really. And is it a bit of a soapbox for the guy to kind of give his views on religion and what it should be like? Yeah, a little bit, but I think it's respectful enough that it keeps the intrigue and the mystery the core kinetic point of the book. That we're here for the story and the mystery and the unveiling of the mystery. And really, I think this lines up a lot with other Freemasonic ideas and texts and stuff. And it's something I was surprised by is somewhere in the end here, even one of the characters mentions, it was, misinterpreted in the movie Eyes Wide Shut. And all I can say is that Kubrick, shortly after producing Eyes Wide Shut, I believe he died, while the director for this movie and also the writer of this book, it was still kind of kicking around. So I don't know who's telling what or who's telling the truth, but you know what, there it is. Anyway, and so Robert Langdon meets this French police cryptographer, and the person who was killed was Jacques Sanguier, who is the head curator of the Louvre. And so they find him, laid out in this weird stance. I'll spoil it of the Venturian man, and he has all this symbolism. There's writing in his own blood. There's things written in blacklight, and so suddenly this, American professor and this young police officer have to work together to solve the mystery of this man, who's also her grandfather, by the way. And her name is Sophie Sanguier, and so they have to work together and build a relationship, and then realize that they're being played. I really do like how the tension in the first few scenes are written. Something that I think was a really cool scene that I don't really remember from the movie, that I think is a really cool trick, is Sophie gives Robert the number of the embassy or something, along with like an access code or something that he has to punch in. And so when he dials it, it goes to her, the number he dials goes to her voice answering machine. And he's like, oh, he's about to say, you gave me the wrong number, but she shoots him a glare, and she's like communicating to him that you are basically in danger. And so he punches in the number to get to the access to her answering machine, and then she says, yeah, just stay calm, listen to my voice, so you're in danger. And it's like they can't even talk in front of the police. And it's this really cool way to communicate covertly in the presence of people you think you can trust. And so it just really escalates. And I love this kind of storytelling. I think it was David Fincher in his movies. I think it's like Fight Club, The Zodiac Killer. He says the way or the method of him telling these stories is always about following the kind of crumbs of truth. And it's just about how a new piece of information changes the context of everything, and you just feed that, and you just follow it to the next bit of information, which again changes everything. And in the first few scenes, the dynamics shift so interestingly, where the police officer who he thought was kind of a rude guy actually turns out to be a very open-minded guy, turns out to be the guy who's actually in on it, and it considers him to be the prime suspect in the case. And the kind of know-it-all cryptographer realizes she knows way little than he does, and humbles her, and then realizes she actually is on the take, and knows that the police are on the take, and that she's actually there on a second secret mission that she doesn't even really know about. So the dynamics are really good. I really enjoy it. And so I won't spoil everything, or maybe I should. I'm sure everyone's seen it by this point. But they go on this, this worldwide chase for religious artifacts, and decrypting things and finding a bunch of things about Da Vinci, and learning history and mixing it with action and intrigue and thrill and all that stuff. And of course, mixing it with church history and conspiracy. And so this was like a really cool way to, I guess, introduce a lot of people. I definitely my first introduction into the idea of esoteric Christianity or these secret orders or whatever. It was kind of a very family-friendly way to do it. And like I said, now that I've actually read a lot of more esoteric literature, this seems to line up with a lot more of that. And just what I've seen in general. So yes, it goes into Templars, Freemasons, all that stuff, where is the Holy Grail? What is the Holy Grail? And so the overall arching thing which permeates the book is that there's a worship of the divine feminine. It's the sacred female is kind of their main thing. And, so it's a bit, pushy in that way, where it's like, women have been oppressed, but the real secret, the real secret is that women are actually divine and magical, and this is through certain characters in history and whatever. And so trying to shows it as a kind of female worship cult that's been masquerading as all of these authoritarian or different religious organizations throughout the centuries, and it's only the enlightened people who come to this revelation, basically. So it is kind of pushing in a certain direction, and of course they try to give a certain direction that Christ was. Oh, everyone knows that he wasn't divine. So it's very kind of modern in that sense. Of course, it's allowed to get made in a secular framework where it's like, oh yeah, of course he was a great teacher in all of his teachings, but he wasn't really divine, and we all know that. And then it goes into the whole conspiracy that everything was man-made. Constantine basically constructed the religion at the time of his death, while also admitting that he wasn't devout at all and he only did it for political reasons and was only baptized on his deathbed, which is true. So there's a lot of truth in what this book says about how the Templars were established in 1099, roughly after the First Crusade. The kings of France, the Merovingians, some of them at least claimed, according to myth, to have bloodlines related to Jesus Christ. That's kind of the main thing, is that it turns out the Holy Grail is actually not the cup from which Jesus drank, but is actually this idea of basically the sarcophagus of Mary Magdalene, and the fact that Mary actually had an offspring with Jesus, and that his bloodline still exists today. And just being alive for a couple three or so decades, you do find people who do make those claims, not super, I guess openly, but not in a boisterous way. Like there's some Dutch banker who claims he's descended from Jesus Christ, or some Dutch or French, like not a king, but royalty or nobility who is now a banker who claims to be a descendant from Christ, but they don't make it a big deal. It's like they're not looking for public approval. It's just kind of very casual, like, oh yeah, everyone in the inner circle of the upper echelons of higher society of Europe we just know it's just a fact. So you hear these things and you're like, okay, well, maybe. And it's like, I don't know, is this their way of like telling the world an open secret? How many Hollywood movies have kind of told too much about aliens or all these other weird things that people aren't supposed to know? Who says if it's just a kind of misinterpretation to make people not think about this stuff, or a derivative or something that's I don't know. But the only thing I know is that Eyes Wide Shut is the one movie that got a lot of criticism because it seemed to be too close to the truth. So I would take that for what it is. And that's the other thing too. They said in the Eyes Wide Shut part, like, oh, everyone thinks it's these weird sex parties and sex magic, but no, it's really a divine magical thing, without going into any more detail. So it's just like, yeah, I think we all know what's really going on here. It's probably just a bunch of perverted rich people, but that's fine. Anyway, but yeah, there's a lot of really neat little puzzles in here. It goes into, again, some very true things like phi. The number 1.81 or 61 or something. No, 1.181 or 61 or 65. It's a mathematical number that if you find it, and apparently you find it in nature, if you multiply everything by that number, it's considered the number of beauty or the number of harmony, because your forearm is one phi times your upper arm, and every point of your finger is phi from your hand. And so if you measure your body, everything grows by phi. And they say phi is found in architecture and or Roman architecture and even music, and that it's this universal number of beauty. And so that's also related to things like the golden ratio and the rose symbol with 5 petals, which is supposed to represent the Rosicrucians, and also the 5-pointed star, which they argue in ancient times is a pagan symbol, represented the female beauty, and the Venturi man. I forget exactly how the 5-pointed star, the pentagram, was associated with female energy, but apparently it was. And so you have the rose, the 5-pointed star, that predate all of its modern symbolism allegedly, and some interesting things too that pagan. Oh, I forget what pagan was, but it goes into the Latin meaning of a lot of terms, which is good. Like heretic is like heretus or something, which means to choose. I find really interesting that what was it? Oh, pagan meant something like a countryside person, and that's also like villager. At some point, became villain. That's what they allege. I don't know about that, but it's kind of like you're a uneducated country person who doesn't understand. It's like, okay, well, that's kind of legit, I guess. It is other things too, like, oh, Leonardo da Vinci was actually the lead of this esoteric female worshipping cult, and that all religion is a scam and the church is evil. And it's kind of like, okay, well, we've heard this before, right? But I do kind of, even if you're Christian or whatever, I recommend this absolutely, because it goes into a lot of like general church history that is good to know. Like the Templars. They did set up an establishment. They were one of the first major successful banking empires, which were weirdly followed by the Medicis and all this other stuff. And, how that was the birth of, modern banking in Europe. And, certain events and characters that, frankly, I wish were common knowledge, but simply aren't. And just the general kind of exposure to secret societies. They do go into like the basic Masonic things about the checkered floor, how Temple Church in the UK is based off of Solomon's Temple because it has a rounded back entrance, or a rounded figure rather. And I always wondered about that because I saw it, and apparently there's a lot of Roman architecture in the UK or in Europe in general. But the idea there, Temple Church, was that it was, a church, but it had like a temple basis. So it's one of the few churches that really mixes Roman and Gothic architecture together. So it's a very weird looking structure. And apparently the roundness is supposed to represent the pantheon, how all the gods were kind of equal in a circle, and also represented the sun. And that's why they also looked like that in Constantine times, because they worshiped the sun, which is also Constantine. I'm like, oh yeah, okay, that does kind of actually make sense why the Romans believed what they believed. And then they bring up all the fun points about, Mithras, being born on December 25th. I think he dies and gets resurrected. They don't mention the whole part that he slays a bull, because then it's like, oh, that's kind of weird. And then they give all the similarities about, I think Osiris also was born on December 25th. And so, again, it is good to note, like, oh yeah, there are all these different, correlations or things that were adopted for, how would you say, not political reasons, but for convenience reasons, like, oh, that's already our harvest season festival, we'll just change it to Lent or Easter or, whatever. And people kind of point this out as if it's like a big deal. And it is kind of a big deal, but it's like all those holidays were replaced. But it's, most people realize, oh, December 25th is probably not Jesus's real birthday. And it's like, how would we figure that out? I'm sure people have tried, and we haven't been able to do it at this point. So we just kind of settled, this will be a symbolic day, more or less. But yeah, so it goes into that kind of stuff. This kind of atheist first, baby bottle, basically. And yeah, so there are, elements in it that, are really interesting factual elements, and other elements that are kind of more, I don't want to say propaganda, but like, oh, I have a beef or perspective that we are worshiping. The other thing is that they're worshiping Sophia, the Greek word for wisdom, which is where Sophie comes from. And so wisdom, gnosis, revelation, all that kind of stuff. And I think this really kickstarted the whole sort of atheist movement. I mean, most people were agnostics really during that period of, following Richard Dawkins and, oh my God, some early YouTubers like The Amazing Atheist too. I don't want to know where he is now, but, so stuff like that occurs. And it was kind of this moment or this beginning or this reigniting of kind of the Enlightenment era of, rationale versus emotion or blind belief or blind faith. And so, everyone's gone on a journey, I think, over the past couple of decades around that. But that was kind of the beginning of that whole sort of neo-atheist or neo-enlightenment movement, which gave us fedora memes and all that stuff. But yeah, it's still really interesting stuff, regardless if you believe or not. If you do believe, there's even like really cool things about just church history about the Crusades and the apostles, and how they decided to, why Leonardo decided to do certain depictions. One thing that they tried to do is that what was it? They tried to do this thing where, if you look at Jesus here, and then there's like another disciple there who has reddish long hair, and they're arguing that's not one of the disciples, it's actually Mary Magdalene. And if you actually push them together, it looks like they're making an M. And that's the one part where I'm like, okay, that's a little bit cringe. Like you're kind of stretching a little bit there, guys. But yeah, there are other things like the male sign being an upwards triangle, the female sign being a downwards triangle, and them combining to make the Seal of Solomon or the Star of David, which, according to other things I've read, the Star of David is not that. That it's an ancient symbol that really definitely even predates Judaism, and the idea that at least it's useful in the effect of understanding the male and female, or the lower and higher worlds coming together and forming a singular new idea. I think it's useful in that capacity, and it doesn't have to be overridden by a certain perspective, but I think in understanding those kinds of concepts and bringing them together, it's pretty useful in that regard. And again, so there's a lot of esoteric, Kabbalistic things in here. I think a lot of Gnostic ideas obviously are in here, and they're kind of presented as the truth. And again, that's got great exposure to those kinds of ideas, because it is good to know about Gnosticism, why it's right, why it's wrong, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I actually had a lot of fun rereading this, just like rereading certain points, certain facets. Like, regardless of one's faith or whatever, I do wish they would make books like this again, where you at least have some kind of conspiracy, or you bring religious mythology into it. Like, I don't know why, like religious mythology being incorporated into an action movie or something is always just super interesting. It always makes things really cool. Perfect example is probably like Halo. That game, on the surface, you look at it as like, oh, okay, Billy's playing a game about shooting aliens, but all the references, the symbology, the names, the flood, Halo itself, Cortana, that's more esoteric, like the old French, legends and stuff. I love Halo for its adaptation of lore into that setting. It's super cool, and I love it when it happens. I remember I used to make jokes specifically about Robert Langdon, about about washed up university professor, but hey there, hot young French police officer, I guess we're gonna have to solve this case together with my very esoteric, nerdy information. Like, it's just a character that should never be in this situation. Should never be in a situation where it's like, man, I guess you really need me to analyze these symbols, huh? And help Interpol, rush around the city on a worldwide adventure. Oh, this is crazy. he's like a more nerdy, more lame version of Indiana Jones. Like, there's no reason in the world you'd want a religious cryptologist involved in a police case or a car chase or anything. And it's so funny to me. That's just one specific. I like to imagine Dan Brown as like this washed up guy who's like, oh yeah, but then I meet this hot French girl, and then this happens, and it's just a joke. But I on that point though, I think it's really great how they do actually make it a very understandable and feasible thing. Like, why would they need a religious cryptologist to come to a crime scene? And so it's really good because one, the guy, he knows this whole thing, and the guy's murdered in a museum. So it's like it kind of his area of expertise, and he is in Paris, and they know like his name is kind of in the news. So it's kind of like, okay, on that point, maybe. But then number two is that the main character also knew the curator and the director, and that they had planned to meet earlier that evening, but he had like called it off or something. So there's like, okay, you actually know this guy. There is a reason for you to come to the crime scene, or at least be questioned by the police. But then further than that, you also find out there's another motive, that under the black light, there's another secret message written on the guy's own body. and it says, P.S. Find Robert Langdon. So the police, without telling him, because it was in blacklight, thinks that Robert Langdon is actually the murderer and the prime suspect, and that's why he's actually being invited to, because they think he's the criminal. So, to take, someone who really shouldn't be in this certain situation that seems more fantasy, they have a pretty hard, good reasoning for why the police would actually call in this normally kind of useless guy, and it kind of snowballs from there. It actually makes really good logic why he should be there, because it's not just, oh yeah, we need to decipher these symbols, haha. No, we think you did it. And how that whole scene plays out with Sophie giving him, tipping him off to that's what they think, is just a really cool sequence of events. And I also love that scene where he puts the GPS on the soap, throws it onto the truck, and they think he's left, and they're searching all over Paris for him when he's in the exact same place where they left him in the museum. I think that's a great setup. So yeah, this is a good exposure to sort of cults and esoterics, and really questioning church history, and what really did the Council of Nicaea decide, how much of church history is hidden or deceived from people, how much do you actually know about it, how educated are you on it, and does it make a great story? It's like, yes, it really does make a super cool story, even if you just read the Wikipedia page. It's super, super cool. And deciphering fact from fiction, from belief, is kind of up to the reader's interpretation. What is real, what isn't, and what you decide to believe. But again, super cool. Oh yeah, they even went to the whole Freemason thing about the two pillars, Joachim and Boaz. So yeah, it's like an introduction to that world. And again, I just wish they would make stuff more like this. There's really cool lore you could do. For example, I was in Turkey recently, in Istanbul, and they claim to have in the museum, the arm of John the Apostle, and like a golden thing. And it's like, it's one thing to fake, oh, this is Jesus's cup or his veil or his sitting stool or his preaching rock or something. But it's another thing to make up a fake artifact of like one of the side characters of the Bible. And what it is, what was the arm of John the Baptist? I think it was John the Baptist. It was like a skeletal arm that was encased in gold. And you think about how, in the post fall of the Roman Empire, that a lot of artifacts probably went to the existing Christian Roman Empire, which was the Greek Empire, Byzantium, and how a lot of the artifacts probably ended up there anyway. So I saw that and I was like, whoa, that's kind of cool, actually. It was very moving, actually, seeing it. But anyway, that's just a taste of that. If anything, play Assassin's Creed 2 again. Fantastic game. Definitely gave me the same vibes as this. And overall a fun book, but slow in parts. But that's pretty much it. Anyways, as always, thanks for watching, and keep reading.